to look at Uganda, the president there is very pro-Bitcoin and blockchain. So that's how Binance got in. So many Africans, especially poor Africans, have smartphones. Corruption is rife in Africa, unfortunately. They could now send value via SMS, and that changed the game.
Welcome to Down the Rabbit Hole, your easy-to-understand podcast on the blockchain and beyond. My name is Tim Lee, and thank you so much for joining me in this journey into the ever-evolving and sometimes elusive world of the blockchain. In this episode, I will be talking with James Preston, who runs the South African Crypto Podcast. We'll be talking about the realities of trying to bank the unbanked in South Africa. Is banking the unbanked just a pipe dream for blockchain technology? Let's find out as we head down the rabbit hole. Nothing in the Down the Rabbit Hole podcast should be considered as investment or legal advice. The blockchain and cryptocurrency markets globally are unregulated, high risk, and constantly changing. You're advised to seek professional guidance before contemplating any opportunities within the blockchain and cryptocurrency space. Really pleased to introduce James Preston from Durban in South Africa. He is the project lead at SA Crypto, and we're going to talk about the blockchain and cryptocurrency in South Africa and the African continent, because there's almost, in the West, we always talk about banking the unbanked, and it'd be good to actually hear from somebody on the ground. So, James, listen, welcome. I'm so pleased that you could join us. Thanks for taking the time.
Tim, it is a real pleasure. Thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a real privilege to connect with an entrepreneur like yourself and quite a blockchain influencer, certainly based in Sydney there, speaking at conferences all over. You've written a book, so it's a real privilege to be on the podcast, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of this.
Oh, James, so am I. Listen, just for the sake of our audience, because we've got both people in Australia and all over the world that are tuning in, so do you want to just give us just a quick background of who you are? I mean, obviously I've given the top line, but I'm just really interested in your background and what got you into crypto and where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, funny enough, is two things. Firstly, it's radio. I got into radio when I was 10 years old. I was doing what I'm doing now, messing around with audio desks, sound desks. I got my own little mixer when I was 12 and got into radio very early on. I actually was doing drive time radio in my final year at high school.
Are you serious?
Yeah, so radio's been a big passion of mine, and communications. Involved in the newsroom there and reporting, journalism, all those kind of things. I also got into ministry, funny enough, a lot of philanthropic work, and my wife and I got into ministry. So I spent 8 years in the ministry, but never left my radio roots. I stayed on radio as a sort of part-time hobby. One of South Africa's first podcasts, we can't verify that just yet, but started one of South Africa's first podcasts. And the ministry got me face to face with inequality. I mean, I'm sure, as you would know and as you would have seen, obviously South Africa is an incredible place in that there are wide inequalities, social inequalities, economic inequalities, and my philanthropic ministry work got me face to face with these inequalities. And through my podcast and through my website, I started blogging about these financial situations. And then obviously the financial crash happened in 2008. And I became more and more invested in economic philosophy and began writing about it, and got introduced to Bitcoin in 2012. Wrote my first blog post on it, I think, in 2013, round about there. And just like your book, I went down the rabbit hole, Tim, and haven't come back.
It has that effect on people, doesn't it?
Exactly.
It's addictive. It's addictive.
Absolutely. I realized this was the future, in the same way that the internet has changed the world, blockchain is going to change the world. And one thing led to another. I left the ministry in 2012 to start my own business. And 4 businesses later, here I am, full-time crypto. We started SA Crypto. I took over from the founders who started their own blockchain R&D company. And here we are. I'm now running South Africa's first blockchain news website. So it's very exciting, and I couldn't be happier to be doing what I love. Radio, audio, media, and blockchain. It couldn't get better, really.
Oh, amazing stuff. Well, it's a really interesting background. I can't believe you did your first radio broadcast at 10. and drive time. I mean, that's I feel honoured to have your dulcet tones on the podcast. So,
Well, yeah, they do say Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours. I've probably done my 10,000 hours of radio, but
you've done about 250,000 hours. I can't believe you're only 21.
I can't add it all up. Back then, getting into obscure radio stations here in Durban, South Africa is not that hard, Tim. I'm sure you'd be able to get yourself a really good radio show here in South Africa with a little bit of British golden voice. You'd be right up there.
Yeah, but I haven't got your charm, wit, repartee, and youth, to be honest.
Please.
Or
I got to correct you. I hope you don't think I'm 21, hey?
I know. I'm just trying to make you feel good. That's all.
Oh, okay. Just so that your audience is like, wow, the guy's 21. Flip, he's an overachiever of note. No ways.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I can sort of. You're a millennial-ish, and I'm a sort of a dinosaur. I think is probably the best way of saying the difference. But like you, I mean, I actually got involved in the internet way back in 1995. And February the 12th, 1995 at 2:16 p.m. in the afternoon. I remember it that cathartically when I was in the UK. And I walked into a little internet provider, the second one in the UK, and we connected via a 14 4K modem. Nightmare of a squealy thing. And we connected to an art gallery 10 kilometers away, and there was this, what I can only term as a concrete block that passed for a monitor in those days, and just these paintings came up one line at a time, and I saw this painting, and that blew my mind.
Wow.
So much so we set up an internet cafe, bar and restaurant, web design house, which we sold in 2001. And so I absolutely understand what you say when you have those cathartic moments, because when I first came across the blockchain rather than Bitcoin, which I'll come on in a second, that I had that same cathartic moment that you've had. I mean, I got involved in Bitcoin in 2011 and I didn't buy. I thought it was way too geeky. This would never go anywhere. It was like Second Life. It was like Farmville, all those sorts of things. But yeah, how wrong was I? But the most important thing is we're both down this rabbit hole right now. And I guess it'd just be really good just to get a feel for the South African rabbit hole, because it is such a different continent. I mean, just as I might have said in our early dialogue prior to the podcast today, my mother lived and worked in Botswana for 15 years, so I managed to get down to South Africa and Botswana. So Africa's a bit in my blood, but obviously not the same as sort of talking to someone who's got feet in the ground. So I guess the key thing is, James, I mean, what's your experience of sort of corporate adoption of blockchain in South Africa and around the African continent then? I mean, what are you seeing that's particular to South Africa?
I think the first thing is that regulation is going to be a problem. We can't deny that. In terms of, I guess in terms of financial adoption, that could be a challenge. And I think we've got to look at the realities of how people earn money and how people will spend money. At the moment is in fiat. So they need to cross over from fiat into crypto, into Bitcoin, I believe, mostly at this stage. And so the regulation is going to be a challenge. Fortunately, here in South Africa, the South African Reserve Bank have been quite pro blockchain and crypto. They have already run a project with Consensus, actually, in which they trialed interbank transfers on the blockchain here in South Africa, 7 different banks. And they ran this trial. They did a whole media launch, and they got up to, I stand corrected, but up to 90,000 transactions per second on the blockchain. So
wow.
The South African Reserve Bank are very, very pro blockchain technology. But in terms of mass adoption, I think it still remains to be seen. If we look at the African continent as a whole, there's no two ways about the fact that this is the future. You just have to look at Uganda. The president there is very pro Bitcoin and blockchain. So that's how Binance got in. The president approached Binance, and that opened a relationship. Now Binance have opened one of Africa's first Binance outlets, which is huge.
In Uganda?
In Uganda, that's right. So
wow.
I know Luno, for instance, one of Africa's biggest crypto exchanges, are doing very well in Nigeria. So there is a lot of hope. There's a lot of light. And I think the adoption is going to sort of be a tide which is going to switch over. At the moment, it's sort of creeping up slowly, and all of a sudden we're going to look and everyone's got it. It's difficult to predict exactly when and how that's going to happen, but I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in the space. So many Africans, especially poor Africans, have smartphones. A cheap smartphone, probably worth about between 40 and 60 US dollars. And these smartphones, obviously Android based, they can have blockchain based wallets. So they're one step away from everyone adopting it. And I think we're not too far away.
It's interesting you made the point about it's going to suddenly creep up. I mean, I was speaking on a panel about 3 weeks ago, and one of my fellow panelists said that he quoted Steve Jobs when he said that technology should either be beautiful or invisible. And I think we're going to see blockchain being invisible. It's that enabler, I think, altogether. And I think what you said is absolutely right, that it's going to suddenly creep up. I mean, certainly here in Australia, a lot of corporates, sort of seeing companies enter what I term as the 4 Ps. It's the proof of concept, the prototype, the pilot, and then the puffing up of chests. So there's been a lot of, especially in 2017, as soon as any listed company mentioned the word blockchain, their share price spiked. I mean, even in the States it happened with a Long Island Tea Company, I think it was, that announced they were doing something on the blockchain. And
Kodak as well.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Kodak almost rescued their company by announcing blockchain focus and their own miner. So absolutely, mention blockchain and your share price goes through the roof at this stage.
Absolutely. If you mention it now, I think it probably falls about 30%. But but I think obviously there's a lot of stuff happening under the surface, as we know. But I mean, one thing that I find particularly interesting about Africa as a whole, it's out of Kenya, the M-Pesa product, the payment platform that's all based around the cheap mobile phones that you're talking about. I mean, and I saw a stat recently that M-Pesa now accounts for about 40% of Kenya's GDP. I mean, do you know much about M-Pesa? Do you see much mention of it in the media in Africa as a whole, in South Africa in particular?
Yeah, absolutely we do, Tim. This is, again, the creeping up invisibility of technology, which you just can't put your finger on. They tried to trial M-Pesa here in South Africa, and it didn't take off. To be honest, no one really knows why. But Kenya was just poised. It was like a market that was poised where people had your basic phones before smartphones were ubiquitous. People had the cheap sort of $10 smartphones where it was text message and SMS based. So M-Pesa was text message based. And all of a sudden, everyone had these phones and they could now send value via SMS. And that changed the game in Kenya because there's such a rural market there. People had to walk kilometers to get to a bank, and it just made sense. Rather than have to sort out a bank account and all that, I can use my cell phone that I've got. For some reason, they trialed it in South Africa, and it didn't take off. I think it could be because of the ubiquity of banks and the ever-presence of banks here in South Africa. There's a lot of banks in a lot of locations. I don't think banks are as prolific in Kenya. But I think that example shows two things. It shows, firstly, the unpredictability of a technology. No one saw M-Pesa coming, to be honest. And then secondly, it shows that Africa is poised for digital innovation. If you can provide a solution that helps banked the unbanked, as we've heard so much, you are going to see it take off like a viral wildfire. And it's just going to take a blockchain company to get that right. And you're looking at a massive, massive adoption.
Because the thing that I find really interesting about this whole M-Pesa idea is that it was created by a telecoms company, albeit with the blessing of the Central Bank of Kenya, from what I understand. But it's a new payment rail, a new banking rail that has no branch network, and it's just leveraging incredibly basic technology. And I just find that fascinating.
It's got to be basic to work. It just has to work. And it just took someone spotting a gap and spotting an opportunity, and there you go, 40% of GDP. As you say, blockchain is an enabler in the same way that text messaging and a smartphone and cellular network was an enabler for M-Pesa. I think blockchain is an enabler for the next level of true banking. M-Pesa is, in essence, it's airtime based and credit and things like that. You put a blockchain wallet on a smartphone and you have an entire bank. So blockchain is an enabler for the next level.
It's interesting, out of Australia, there is a guy who's created blockchain for a SIM card. And this guy was originally a merchant seaman and created a payments platform for merchant seamen. And he actually developed blockchain for a SIM card. And he actually got some initial orders from places like Uganda to look at, could you actually put the blockchain on to a SIM card, and and to sort of leverage that power. But I'm still waiting to hear more about that. I'll try and get him on the podcast at some stage. But it could be some very interesting sort of technologies, because one of the things that's really interesting about Africa in general, and this brings into account some of my historic experience prior to going down the rabbit hole, is I used to work for HSBC many years ago. And there were many banks in Africa that HSBC could not deal with because there was just simply no trust that they had the compliance structures in place. And as a result, it would be sort of the smaller banks that would get involved, from what we heard, and that they were often charging 10% of a transaction fee as fees, which was ludicrous. It was incredible that people would actually pay those fees, because it was the only horse in town that would actually enable transactions to go, for example, from Australia to Uganda. I know Uganda was one of the problem countries at that time that we had, all because of this lack of compliance. But you mentioned that Uganda have really embraced Binance. So is it that some of the African countries are raising their game for compliance, or is it that they just see that there's an opportunity to leverage this type of technology to cut out the banks?
Tim, no, I don't think that the African countries are raising their game, unfortunately. And I don't want to downplay African nations. There could very well be a number of African listeners outside of South Africa. Obviously, my audience is primarily South African. There could very well be African listeners, and I don't want to discredit and downplay other African nations. But the reality is, and what we've seen is exactly what you've said. Corruption is rife in Africa, unfortunately. Many of the countries are young economies. They've gained independence from their colonial past. You look at Mozambique gaining independence from Portugal, Kenya gaining independence from Britain, Angola gaining independence from, let me get my history correct, Portugal as well, Namibia gaining independence from Germany, South Africa gaining independence from Britain, but much earlier, and then of course had to deal with the sort of Afrikaner apartheid rule. And the list goes on and on and on. So many colonial governments have moved out, and for the first time, these African nations have had to sort of govern on their own. And because their economies are so young, they just haven't come to grips with true governance, with true regulation, and corruption has been rife. And so absolutely, I can imagine, and I know the stories, HSBC, I have no doubt, would not want to bank with a number of countries in Africa because the regulation is just not there. The regulatory framework's not there. And I don't think much has changed for a lot of these African nations just yet. So from a regulatory point of view, I think in that respect, it's probably easier. Because the regulatory framework isn't there, it's probably easier. So Binance getting into Uganda, it's easier because there's nothing stopping them. I think it would be harder for Binance to get into South Africa because the South African Reserve Bank is quite advanced in many ways. And so I don't think regulation is going to be the problem. But having said that, I do think innovators and entrepreneurs that come into African nations, or at least come out of African nations, are going to need to make a very close bed with top-level government. In the same way that what I've heard with the Binance Uganda example, it was the very president of Uganda that approached Binance. If you have that kind of top-level trust and relationship with a government official, the door will swing wide. And then once you have that, there's probably not much regulatory framework to roll out your new blockchain technology.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, from the outside in, and obviously it's a very different lens that you have, James, so I fully appreciate that. So from the outside in, you hear of so much corruption in a lot of the African countries, especially Northern Africa, I guess Nigeria, especially with the 415 scams that keep on coming through and that type of thing. It's very, very few people that would actually tackle those markets. But as you say, if the Ugandan president knocks on the door and says, look, here's an opportunity, you're going to embrace it, potentially, providing you don't have a situation where assets might be misappropriated. I'm not suggesting for a minute that Uganda would do that, but that's always a threat that you have, or that one has. Yeah, from my lens, taking an outside view of Africa. I know obviously you've got a different view, so I'm interested in what you think.
You're 100% right, Tim. A lot of companies, big companies, would be afraid to move in because they know that a government official is going to say, hey, listen, if you're coming in through my door, I want a good cut of whatever your profits are. That is a very real situation and a very real problem that companies have had to deal with as they come into Africa. So there's no two ways about the fact that is an issue. Look, I don't have an easy answer to that. That you're right. That I can't stand here from South Africa and say, no, Tim, the doors are wide open, come in, people are trying to do things well. I can say that a lot of the countries are maturing. So Kenya, for instance, as a government is maturing. Mozambique is another one that is maturing in terms of trying to root out corruption. South Africa's very own president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has come forward and said, we are going to do our very best to root out corruption as much as possible. Look, I mean, it's rife and it's in every corner of the government structures, but there are countries that are tackling it. But then the other side of the coin is, if you look at M-Pesa, the opportunity is there. You look at the population of Africa as a whole, how many African people are using smartphones these days, and internet adoption through cellular networks. I mean, I can tell you that South African cellular networks have gone into Africa. The likes of MTN, Vodacom, which is a partner of Vodafone, have gone into African nations, and they have built remarkable cellular infrastructure, which is the first layer of internet connection and internet connectivity. So the reality is the audience is there, the market is there. It's now just a case of either overcoming the corruption problem or someone just saying, you know what, to hell with it. I'll set 20% aside because if someone's going to ask for a bribe, I've got 20% aside. We're going to go in because we want this market. The market is that big. The market is that lucrative. And then, of course, if your business is blockchain based, you can have a traceability of where all that money's going anyway. But that's probably 5-10 years away. So short answer, you're right, Tim. Corruption is still a problem which needs to be overcome.
Right. And it's interesting, just seeing the M-Pesas and that type of thing, it actually almost means that a lot of African countries have the potential to leapfrog over a whole layer of technologies that maybe incumbents have got in the Western world, especially if everything is sort of heading towards the cell phone, mobile phone. I mean, here in Australia, we've got a number of neobanks that are setting up that are just literally internet-based, based around apps, based around mobile phones, that don't have that whole layer of infrastructure of branch networks and that type of thing. I mean, it's really potential that Africa could be a massive opportunity for those that really understand the tech, get to grips with the local issues like corruption and that type of thing that you're talking about. I mean, it's a massive opportunity.
No two ways about it. Just here in South Africa, there's two banks that come to mind. A new one that is now just been listed as South Africa's leading bank, Capitec Bank, and they're only 3-4 years old. The other 6-7 major banks in South Africa, we're talking 50 years plus. This bank is 3 or 4 years old, and they've leapfrogged to become the leading bank by user base. And why? Because they've taken the approach of, we are targeting the low-income market, your rural-based market, and they have done an incredible job of utilizing the infrastructure, apps on your phone, cellular networks, and that's just one. Now there's a new one coming out, exactly as you say, in Australia, which is branchless. There is no central office. There are no branches. The whole banking system is going to be on your phone. And the irony is, it's being spearheaded by a former CEO of one of South Africa's leading banks, FNB. His name's Michael Jordan.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So absolutely. You take that model of what's happened with Capitec, of Bank Zero, this new bank being launched very shortly, what they're doing, and you put that in Kenya, in Uganda, in Rwanda, Mozambique, and you're going to see the same kind of thing. And we are seeing that, Tim.
It's actually really positive and refreshing because it really is hitting that narrative of banking the unbanked. As you said earlier on, if people no longer have to walk 4 or 5 hours to a bank, that means they don't have to take time off work. It means they can spend more time with their family. It's all the things that we take for granted in the West, and it's all these building blocks that can really help to expand and really help Africa as a continent to really ramp up its development.
Yeah. The moment the people have access to finance, you create a whole new economy. And I think that's when you see that, we're going to see a mushroom of growth in Africa. That's what the South African government recognized when they came out of apartheid, was if we can grow our middle class, especially the previously disadvantaged middle class, if the previously disadvantaged group of people can enter the middle class en masse, we're going to see a growing economy, which is what we saw for many, many years. And then we hit the recession, obviously, in 2008, 2009. And I think just from my observation, the only challenge is going to be the mobile phone. If your value remains on your mobile phone, the challenge that you have is obviously if the phone gets stolen, your phone becomes the asset which you now need to protect. So if your identity can somehow be reserved outside of, if it can be sovereign from your mobile phone here in Africa, I think then you're onto something. I mean, in South Africa, crime is unfortunately quite a serious issue. Mobile phones are a hot property amongst criminals. It's just when someone gets mugged, the first thing that gets asked for is your cell phone. They're not after your wallet, it's your cell phone first. And I see that as being the big challenge to overcome. If you can somehow get your value and your wallet sovereignly off the phone. So sure, it's accessible through the phone, but can it be accessed outside of the phone? If you can somehow shut off the access to the phone if it gets stolen, then you're A for away. So the cell phone solves the problem of having to go to a branch 20 kilometers away, but it now creates a new problem in that your bank is now in your possession, and that becomes a risk as well.
It's sort of dragon's teeth in some ways, isn't it? You solve one problem and you create a bit of another problem. But it's just fascinating because I think the neobanks here in Australia are very much targeting the millennials as a whole. But it seems as if the neobanks in South Africa are targeting rurals and probably the rural community and probably millennials at the same time. So it's interesting, that dynamic, because as I say, I mean, banking the unbanked is such a cliche in the Western world, but it seems as if things are actually being done to actually help that.
Yeah, it's happening fast. It's happening right in front of our eyes here in South Africa. There's no two ways about the fact that it is millennials as well being targeted, because a lot of these rural communities have young people who are teaching their mothers, their grandmothers, their grandparents how to use the phone. And they are now, I've seen it with my own eyes. You have sort of your baby boomer generation, your Generation X generation, sitting there on their phones, sitting at the bus stop waiting for their bus, but they're sitting on a $40 smartphone that has been shown or has been taught to them how to be used by their grandchild. And so there is definitely a millennial aspect to what's happening here.
I guess in some ways it's that sort of necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? And if people can really see the added value that these new banking facilities bring, and it's the old quantum of 10 times better, 10 times cheaper, 10 times faster, that really does open up just so many opportunities for the individuals in rural areas. I mean, that's just, it's a nice warm feeling that, that technology can really do some good. Yeah.
And just to come to your point of 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, we just have to look at what happened in Zimbabwe. Just north of South Africa, Zimbabwe was under major crisis, under a dictator like Robert Mugabe, and people were flocking to Bitcoin because there was a necessity for it. Their currency had collapsed. They had transitioned over to the US dollar, and US dollars now were hard to come by. People were flocking to Bitcoin to try and hedge against their out-of-control inflation. And why? Because it was cheaper to send money, receive money. I mean, in South Africa, there are a number of Zimbabwean immigrants who are working here and sending money back across the border to Zimbabwe through African versions of Western Union and MoneyGram and those kind of things. And now they're using Bitcoin. A lot of them are using Bitcoin, sending Bitcoin across the borders because it's just easier, it's faster, and it's cheaper.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I think Bitcoin could well ultimately have a role in difficult economies. It's happening in Venezuela as well right now, and it was happening before in Argentina in 2012 to 14. Exactly the same type of thing where inflation's at 1,000, 2,000%. and the governments impose currency restrictions, and the best way that people can actually ensure that there's a stable value is Bitcoin, because, I mean, okay, it can still be volatile, but because it's not owned by anybody, it actually really does give that added value to countries that are experiencing difficulty.
Yeah, exactly. Bitcoin is not exposed to governmental political interference. It may be exposed purely to the speculative price fluctuations, but those price fluctuations are based on the supply and demand principle and not based on political interference, which every other financial crisis is either regulatory, big corporate, or politically affected.
Yeah, interesting. So just in general terms, I mean, what are the best South African blockchain companies that we should look out for over the next, 3 to 5 years? What do you reckon? Any that stand out to you?
I don't want to sound impartial. This podcast we're going to publish on our podcast as well, but
okay.
I'll be honest as well. I think first and foremost, we've got to look at Luno. Luno are one of the first cryptocurrency exchanges here in South Africa, and they have rocketed to international growth. They're now their main international offices in London. They have exchanges in Europe, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria. So for me, they are the leading company. Obviously, that's an exchange. Then there's another company, little less known, company called Linem Labs, and I'm seeing a lot of innovation coming out of Linem Labs. They're almost an incubator and a facilitator, just a facilitator of the conversation. What's happening in this new tech? What's happening in this new industry? But through that, there's a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of startups who are coming together, talking and developing, and they're producing. I've already seen a couple of companies come out of them, which look very, very exciting indeed. There's so many. Another one SA Crypto is very closely linked to is Avantcore. Avantcore have some of the best developers in South Africa, in my opinion, if not the world. I mean, they've even got representation in Sydney. I think they are one to look out for. I think in the next 5 years, they could be one of South Africa's leading fintech companies, to be honest. Those are just some that come off the top of my head. CoinDirect is another one that they're experimenting. They're a crypto exchange, but they started off with the P2P, the peer-to-peer approach. And so unlike Luno and other traditional exchanges, they're allowing and facilitating direct peer-to-peer transactions. So that's completely off the grid. A peer-to-peer transaction is off the grid. They make their money through an escrow mechanism. So you deposit your fiat into a sort of escrow mediator, and the Bitcoin goes across, and once the transaction is validated, the funds are released. But that escrow mediator isn't directly linked to sort of financial watchdogs and things like that. So it is truly peer-to-peer. And I think what they're doing is unique. So CoinDirect is another one. Look, another exchange, and I know this is the third exchange in the conversation, is Ice Cubed, commonly known as Ice3X. They've just employed a former South African Reserve Bank executive or sort of manager level person. He doesn't like me to use the term executive, but manager level person. So he's taken over as COO. So Ice Cubed is another one. And then there is another one. Nona Creative is the name of the company. Nona Creative, another blockchain company, very similar to Avantcore, who are doing incredible things in the space. So off the top of my head, those are some companies to look out for. Blockchain Entrepreneurs Club doing some good work. They facilitated a startup which is run by two chartered accountants, and they're putting livestock on the blockchain. And obviously in rural Africa, that's huge. Cows, sheep, chickens, they're actually putting livestock on the blockchain. And this is a project which is coming out of Blockchain Entrepreneurs Club. Blockchain Academy, Sonia Kunnell and her work at Blockchain Academy, for me, is some of the best training work on the continent. They run Africa's largest blockchain conference called Blockchain Africa. So those are just some of the names that I can drop right now here in South Africa that are definitely worth looking out for. And it'd be great to see in 5 years' time how many of those companies are still around and how many of them are leading.
But it's interesting that you mentioned about the executive who wants to be called a manager from the bank joining the organizations, because most definitely you get this sense that there's a compliance and regulation lens that's coming across the whole space right now. Yeah. And I think with security tokens coming through that sort of March to June next year, I can just sort of sense that's where the whole market's going to go. I don't know, just in my view, the cryptocurrency community as a whole, and I love the community because they're very passionate and they're very driven in terms of what they do, but it's so often within its own echo chamber.
Yeah.
That it's almost as if, here's the technology, come on, you financial institutions, come and get it. We're the leaders in this, you come and get it. And the financial institutions say, we've got the money, we've got distribution. If you want it, you come to us. You play on our terms. And I think that's where security tokens are really going to start to take off. I mean, are you hearing much talk about security tokens in South Africa?
No, we're not. I think South Africa is a little behind in that regard, but also because the space is very unregulated. So while I mentioned earlier that the South African Reserve Bank has been very sort of open to it, experimenting with their interbank blockchain transfers with a project Corker, while they've been very open to it, they haven't jumped in and said, okay, ICOs are bad news and ICOs, we're shutting them down. Unfortunately, there's been quite a few scam ICOs which have run throughout South Africa. So I think in that regard, we're a bit behind. I prefer it, obviously, from a sort of cypherpunk angle, which is just let the people run, let's just allow innovation to take its course rather than over-regulate. I mean, in my opinion, what's happened in the USA, it's driven a lot of innovation outside of the USA to Canada, to Isle of Man, to Seychelles. I mean, look at BitMEX. BitMEX is sitting in the Seychelles now because they weren't allowed to do what they're doing in the USA. And I understand that the SEC are protecting the public and all those kind of things, but in some ways, that sort of unregulated approach facilitates and allows innovation. The flip side is you get a lot of scams. And so South Africa, unfortunately, has been exposed the market has been exposed to a lot of scam ICOs. And there are very few dinkum ICOs which I can think of. Two, one which in essence failed by targets in terms of what they wanted to raise. And the other is still in early stages ICO phase. And there's one more which I don't know the results of, which are doing okay. So that's three that I can think of. I can name 5 scam ICOs here in South Africa. So, security tokens, I think, are still a good year out. Apparently, the South African Reserve Bank is going to be publishing a paper on their approach and their stance on cryptocurrency and digital assets later this month, and that could change the game. But until then, it's still the ICO space here in South Africa. So if you want to run an ICO, come to South Africa. I mean, I can tell you these scams have raised a lot of money, which is sad, unfortunately. Pyramid schemes here, Ponzi schemes like BitConnect here in South Africa are rife. Yeah, if you want to run an ICO and it's a proper project, come to South Africa. At the moment, the space is still wide open. Security tokens probably a year away.
Right, interesting. Look, James, it's been really interesting talking to you. I could talk for hours because, there's so much that's different about the African continent as compared to the West, and that does present a different dynamic. And you've highlighted quite a few of those examples, like Uganda and Nigeria, welcoming cryptocurrency and welcoming Binance in Uganda and that type of thing. So, I'd love to sort of stay in touch and just keep the dialogue going, because I think it's just this technology could really help the unbanked, and certainly from what you're saying, there's a lot of activities going on in that space that are going towards that goal.
Absolutely. Yeah, Tim, it's been a real treat, and agreed. This rabbit hole conversation could go on forever, couldn't it?
I know, absolutely. Well, look, thanks, mate. I really appreciate it. Appreciate all your time, and thanks, James. I really appreciate you taking the time to do so.
Yep,
speak soon.
No problem. Cheers.
So there you have it. Africa is a complex continent. With so many corrupt governments, it makes it difficult to implement new changes that could bring about transparency. That said, because of the comparative lack of sophistication of the infrastructure, especially in rural areas, technology has the potential to leapfrog the heavyweight legacy systems that exist in the West. Undoubtedly, this means the technology will gravitate more towards mobile technology in a very similar way to the neobanks in the West. This rise in mobile banking technology has already begun to improve day-to-day life for many in rural areas in Africa. With the potential to place blockchain on a SIM card, this could open up so many new possibilities. It'll be very interesting to follow the progress of banking the unbanked to see how this pans out over the next few years, but the foundations are already beginning to be built. In the next episode of Down the Rabbit Hole, we will be looking at how the loyalty industry is approaching the use of blockchain. We will be talking to Phil Shelper from Loyalty and Reward Co., whose book Blockchain Loyalty has just been released. We're joined by Michael Bassina, partner from Piper Alderman Lawyers, who heads up their blockchain group and who has extensive experience within the loyalty space. Is loyalty the next currency? Find out more in the next episode as we continue our journey down the rabbit hole.